These are people whose lives were transformed by learning that Jesus rose from the dead, and they changed the world. For example, have you heard of the general next to God? Have you heard of his wife, even smarter than he was, Catherine Booth? Let me tell you about them, the founders of the Salvation Army. William Booth was tall, 6'1", hollow-cheeked, and a human dynamo. Let me tell you about his London. In his childhood, there was 3 million people, 100,000 paupers, 30,000 vendors who, if it rained for 3 days, could starve to death. When the young boy Booth walked through the East End, he would find 5-year-old children blind drunk. He would see mothers pouring beer down the throats of babies. He would see people smash into a baker's shop and come out with arms full of loaves of bread. He saw crime, assassination, sadness, and the poor of the world lived in filthy hovels, no sanitation, and nobody cared. But when he was 15, William Booth had a strange experience. It was 1844, 11 o'clock at night. He worked as a pawnbroker's assistant. His father had gotten him the job when he was only about 13. But this night in 1844, a spiritual power seemed to grip him, and he suddenly realised that all the suffering and sorrow he saw in London that existed all over the world was because of sin. All the pain of the world was because of sin, either directly or indirectly. And he realised he was a sinner. He realised he must confess his sins to people he'd hurt. He must make restitution where it should be made. And he did all these. And then he went to his employer and said, "Sir, this shop often works on till the early hours of Sunday morning. I am now a Christian. I keep Sunday as the day of worship. I believe I should not work on that day. I will not work for you in the early hours of Sunday morning." And the employer said, "All right, you either do what everybody else does or you're sacked." So Booth was sacked, which was hard on his widowed mother and his sisters, but harder still on his employer, who found he couldn't get on without Booth. So after a few days, the employer swallowed his pride and told Booth he could have all of Sunday off. So he worked 13 hours a day, ate terrible food, which gave him dyspepsia for the rest of his life, and he lived to 83. So from 14 years of age to 83, the man who became the general next to God had dyspepsia. But one day, a Christian employer who owned boot shops right across London said to William Booth, "Give up business. Spend all your time preaching. I've heard you preach. You preach well." William Booth said, "No one will employ me. I will employ you for 3 months. How much do you need to live on?" "Oh," said Booth, "I've got to keep my mother and 2 sisters. 12 shillings a week." "Rubbish," said this man, whose name was Rabbits. How would you like to have that name, Rabbits? "You need at least 20 shillings. I'll give you 20 shillings a week for 3 months if you give up business and just go preaching. So he did. And he often converted 20 people in one day, particularly among the poor. But he found the church in the other end of London didn't like it if he brought poor, ragged, unkempt people from the East End to bring them to church. And at last they compromised. They said, well, you can bring them in a side door and sit them there on the side. Booth never forgot that. One day he would change the world's thinking about things like that. Then came his 23rd birthday. And Rabbit said to him, I want you to come to a special meeting with me. And he did, and he fell in love. He fell in love with this woman. Catherine Mumford knew pain all her life from the age of 14. Curvature of the spine, incipient tuberculosis, pain all her days until the last years of cancer. And while the Salvation Army band played hymns outside her window, she breathed her last and died at the age of 60. But she made the Salvation Army. Without her, the Salvation Army wouldn't exist. This was no ordinary woman. When Booth accepted Rabbit's invitation to go to their house, and he met this petite, dark-eyed girl and immediately fell in love with her, and Rabbit said, now, Mr. Booth, I want you to sing that song you've got about temperance. William Booth was a bit shy about doing that. He wasn't a complete abstainer himself. But Rabbit urged him, so he sang a special song about the evils of alcohol. And some people there were upset, but the petite young girl who'd read the Bible through several times before she was 12, she applauded and she spoke about the evils of alcohol. This woman believed in reform of everything that hurt people. When she'd been but a child, using her stick and her hoop, when she saw a policeman leapfrogging a drunk to the clink, she threw down her stick and her hoop and ran alongside the poor drunken man. Her first protest, but not her last. William asked, could he have the privilege of taking Catherine home that night? So they got a hackney coach and they talked and talked until she was tired out, and she rejoiced to hear him say, now you must not speak any more. But the day came when they married. You know what she said to him? She said, William, we will make our home the brightest spot on earth, and we will be tender, thoughtful, loving and patient. Yes, we will. And yes, they were. The children they brought up were great reformers of the church, because the church did nothing about the suffering of the poor and the sick. Booth couldn't stand that. Catherine couldn't stand it. He was employed by a Methodist offshoot called the New Connection, but as he began to range further and further afield, the leaders of the church didn't like it. They tried to circumscribe him. You can only work in this area. And that beautiful young woman stood up and said, never. Then she walked down and took William's arm, and they left that denomination to serve in it no more, and to establish the Salvation Army, to know what it was to have rotten eggs thrown at them, decaying cabbage, while they knelt in the street to pray for the passers-by. Some hooted and jeered, and others threw at them rubbish. But they established a Christian army that provided millions of beds for the homeless, that employed an employment agency to get jobs for those who were out of work. Hospitals, dispensaries. He established a food for millions where food could be gotten very cheaply but healthfully. Booth changed his world. His core worked ultimately in 143 countries. In his own lifetime, he had 25,000 officers of the Salvation Army, and they were different because they didn't do as the ordinary church did, just cater for the rich and the educated. The hero of William Booth was John Wesley. He said there's only one God and John Wesley was his prophet. And Wesley had said, go out for the souls of men, that's your sole business, and go out for the worst of them. And Booth did that. He would have floundered in poverty. He'd gotten so low he had to sell his furniture, and his wife was fragile. And then 2 ship owners heard him at a tent meeting, and for 50 years they poured money into the Salvation Army so the general next to God could carry on his preaching. But he couldn't have done it without Catherine. One day when General Booth was speaking to 1,000 people, she felt a strange urge. She had long taught that women should do the same duties as men within their strength, that they should teach and they should preach, but she had never done it. She was rather timid, and the devil whispered to her, you'll make a fool of yourself if you stand up and try and preach. And she replied to the devil, that's my trouble. I've been afraid to be a fool for Christ's sake. Well, that's the end of that. And she stood up, began to walk down toward the pulpit. And 1,000 heads turned and looked. Was she sick? Was she ill? And the general stopped his preaching, came down to Catherine. Are you all right, my dear? She said, yes, I want to speak. So General Booth announced to the 1,000 that his wife was going to speak. And that was the beginning of the best woman preacher in England. The only one to match her was a Quaker woman who later was to write The Christian Secret of a Happy Life and The God of All Comfort. These great books were written by a woman who thought like Catherine Booth, that women too should preach. Why put a gag over half of humanity? How ridiculous. The first apostle mentioned by Paul in Romans 16 was a woman. We read that many women ministered to Christ. It is certainly biblical that protests about women speaking in church was when women interrupted with foolish questions, and that Paul would not tolerate. But you can't wipe out Sunday schools, you can't wipe out teachers at school, and you can't wipe out women preachers. So Catherine began to preach and didn't stop until cancer prevailed upon her. She had more intellectual maturity than her husband. She had more tact than William. Without her, there'd be no Salvation Army. A woman changed the world. The army spread everywhere. It was greatly admired by kings and princes and statesmen. But she died and 36,000 people attended her funeral. The general plunged on. When he was 75, he did a tour of Britain over 1,200 miles and preached 165 times. In his lifetime, he travelled 5 million miles. And that was without TWA and all the planes we have had in the last 50 years. 5 million miles. And he preached 60 1,000 times. And when he was almost blind, he went to Denmark and to Holland and to Germany and to Switzerland. And this is how he preached. So long as there are women that weep, I'll fight. So long as there are children who are hungry, I'll fight. So long as men go in and out of prison, I'll fight. So long as there's one soul in the darkness that doesn't know the love of Jesus, I'll fight, and I'll fight forever. And he did preach until at 83 he went to his rest, and 40,000 people attended the funeral. I recommend to you this book by Richard Collier, The General Next to God. Once you start, you'll find it hard to put down. This book on Catherine Booth by Catherine Bramwell Booth, that is her daughter-in-law. When you read how these people changed the world, you think, how much better is the world because I'm here? What am I doing for the world? My friend, if you believe in the resurrection of Jesus, and if you believe his command, go into all the world, tell them I love them, you too can change the world. God bless you.